Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you once again for joining me on these pretty regular updates from Washington. I want to hit 3 or 4 topics at the top, and then I'm anxious to take all your questions. First and most important is the fact that literally just a few minutes ago, by a vote of 65 to 34, we invoked cloture on the bipartisan gun legislation. I want to give a lot of credit to particularly Chris Murphy and John Cornyn, senators from Connecticut and Texas, respectively, who's, I think, kind of walked that narrow line of putting together a sensible gun reform legislation, mental health investment, making sure that those 18 to 21-year-olds, where a lot of these shooters have come from, I would like to see a ban on selling them assault weapons, but they ended up with legislation that would at least be able to check out some of that young person's mental health or other issues that should be relevant, so that you don't at 18 go purchase a couple of assault weapons, which you then go to utilize in dreadful ways. If we've got information about that individual that's relevant, it can now be brought forward. For a lot of people, this legislation didn't go far enough. I think, frankly, the kind of sensible gun reforms we put in place in Virginia should have been the broader model. There will be some, I know, that the fact that 34 senators voted against this shows for some folks it went too far. But the most important thing we're doing, and I think it's even more relevant now because there was a Supreme Court case coming out today that, while I've not had a chance to fully review, would undermine a lot of state laws on gun safety. And I've got to look at that more closely. But the most important thing, I think, of this action, and hopefully we'll pass this bill later today, is saying to the American people that even on a contentious issue like guns, we have found a way to do something. Too much for some, too little for others, but it is so much more significant than the pathetic kind of seeing these tragedies and then politicians offering thoughts and prayers and no actions. So I look forward to voting for this legislation. It will save lives. We will see additional tragedies, and perhaps we will come back, but this is a step forward, and it will save lives, and that is what I think the vast majority of Virginians and Americans want to see us act on. So, number one. This next issue, on a more good news note, and this is a bill that I've been working on for 4 or 5 years. Sometimes even the most logical things take forever. And let me take a moment just to describe it. It is the Joint Consolidation Student Loan Relief legislation. A number of years ago, literally back in the 90s, people could consolidate their student debt together if they got married. Not all marriages stay together. In many cases, somebody could end up being an abused spouse. And even if you were an abused spouse and moved thousands of miles away from your former spouse, you still couldn't get out of that consolidation of your student debt. So the husband that may have abused you may have run up tens of thousands of student debt, and you, if the husband's a deadbeat, you as the abused spouse still have to pay that. You couldn't unwind that consolidation. I think the federal government realized that was a stupid policy because in 2006 they ended it on a going forward basis. But there are still 14,000 federal student loan holders affected by this, had joint consolidation, tens of thousands of private sector student loans that are affected by this. And I heard about it from Sarah, a constituent of mine from McLean, who told just an incredible story of moving literally thousands of miles away from her former spouse, and she was still being, in effect, abused by not being able to get out of this joint consolidation student debt. We finally got it through in the Senate on a unanimous basis, and I'm begging, urging, hoping that the House will take it up very quickly. 2 other items one that I've talked to you all about a number of times, but it is, in my mind, probably my top priority over the next few weeks, and that is to make sure that Congress finally, from a national security, from a jobs, from even trying to longer term, trying to prevent the kind of inflation we're seeing in areas like automobiles, we passed the so-called CHIPS bill, where we would invest $52 billion in making sure that semiconductor manufacturing facilities, research, and next generation wireless, so-called 5G or O-RAN and beyond, that those kind of activities will continue in the United States and not migrate abroad or not end up in China, where China is making literally hundreds of billions of dollars of investment. We passed this bill in the Senate about a year ago. The House didn't pass it till February. We just have to come to a conclusion and get this to the president's desk. And the reason this affects jobs and national security, we don't want our chip supply totally dependent, particularly on China, but candidly, even on some other countries that potentially could not always be friends of ours. And we saw Intel, one of the America's leading semiconductor company, which announced a major chip manufacturing facility in Ohio, announced this morning that manufacturing facility may be on hold or delayed if we can't make this commitment. And what bothers me, and Germany is an ally, but the German government, which had no program at all 11 months ago, have already committed 8 billion euro to Intel to build a facility in Germany. And when European bureaucrats move faster than the American legislative process, we got a problem. So broadly bipartisan, we've got to get it done. If we don't get this done by at least in bill form by middle of July, I'm afraid it could slip, and that will be, that's not going to help us on national security. It's not going to help us on jobs. It's not going to help us on competition with China. And we literally have hundreds of thousands of Ford F-150s that can't get to the market because they're waiting for their semiconductor chips to get in. There is such a shortage. So this is an issue bipartisan we need to get done. Last issue I want to touch on, and this we've seen in lots of stories, local stories around Virginia. One of the things that was smart, and this happened under the Trump administration, I give credit there, we worked with the Trump administration to make sure that student lunch programs and other food delivery programs, as COVID shut down communities, was made easier for families to get this food, particularly during the summer. When school was out, and obviously this was relevant when schools were shut down due to COVID. That program of continuing to allow families, particularly who are hurting now with inflation, to get access in an easy way, where you can pick up a multiple number of lunches at once, where you don't have to simply go to a school to pick it up. These kind of common sense solutions expire June 30th. And it requires, the administration can't do it on its own, it requires the Congress to go ahead and extend those procedures and programs that allow kids to get access to food, poorer kids to get access to food. And it is common sense. We ought to, we're all going to be celebrating July 4th in a couple weeks, and there's way too many American children that are going hungry during the summer, particularly as their families get slammed by inflation. So we got to get this done. It is, again, bipartisan. It is outrageous to me that we've got some of the same usual suspects on the far right who are trying to hold up that common sense piece of legislation that will actually start harming Virginia kids on July 1st if we don't get it extended. So that is another issue that hopefully we can also wrap up in the next 24 hours or so. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Laura and be happy to start taking your questions.
Our first question today will be with Dean Mershahi, WRIC.
Hi, Senator. Thanks for taking the time. I wanted to touch on flight delays and cancellations, moving towards the 4th of July celebration. Several pilots and pilot unions are claiming that airlines have been knowingly scheduling more routes than
I heard speaking,
and leaving passengers stranded when flights are canceled and no new flights available. Do you think that these airlines should be doing more to minimize disruptions for travelers moving forward?
Well, Short answer is absolutely. Every industry got hard hit during COVID. And the airlines got hard hit in virtually more than any other industry. I mean, people stopped traveling during COVID. The flip side, though, is the American government, our taxpayer dollars, had a more generous support program for the airlines than any other industry because we needed to keep, we didn't want all these companies to go bankrupt because once you shut down an airline, starting it back up would take a long time. So we invested all of our money in providing a very, very generous package during COVID for the airlines. So I think they need to do more. Now, this is not simply all the airlines' fault. We've lost a lot of pilots. Candidly, I'm willing to even extend the retirement age for at least a short period of time from 65 to, say, 67 for pilots that want to continue flying. That would help. The deeper you dig in this issue, though, it's not just pilots, but it's a lot of time flight attendants. A lot of flight attendants who got laid off or furloughed during COVID haven't been coming back. And you think about the fact that they receive pretty low pay, and if you've got to get on an airplane for 3 or 4 flights a day, and you've got the amount of abuse that passengers have been giving to flight attendants over the last year plus, the numbers have skyrocketed. Candidly, I get why many flight attendants might not want to come back. And you layer on top of that the fact that there's still a lot of COVID going around. I know in my office, I've probably had higher rates of COVID in the last month than virtually at any time during the whole pandemic. Now, thank goodness, the vast majority of folks, are sick for a few days and it's not been long-term repercussions. But when you have that number of people who are oftentimes at work getting disproportionately abused in an area that frankly didn't pay that much to start with, I think that is creating some of the shortage. In terms of, I have not seen the documentation yet whether there has been an overscheduling of flights, but there are real workforce shortage issues. And what I would hope, and I know Secretary Buttigieg is engaging with the airlines, is let's get a plan here. We stood by the airlines and their workers during COVID. They need to step up now as we try to get our economy fully reopened, as people, particularly who've been cooped up for a long time, want to get out and visit relatives and friends or travel someplace, whether it's a vacation or the beach or camping. We got to get this done, but it's not something you could simply mandate tomorrow. Okay, everybody's got to fly, because there are genuine worker shortages. Just one slight recommendation I would have, and I don't mean this glibly, but a little less abuse from passengers towards flight attendants might keep more of these flight attendants working, which would mean more flights are going to be flying on a regular basis.
I want to remind everyone to please mute your devices when you're not asking a question. Our next question will be Angela Jones with the Hampton Roads Messenger.
Hi, Senator. Thank you for taking my question. In the wake of the recent gun violence and new legislation being proposed, I was wondering if any of the legislation includes school-age children's access to violent video games.
No, Angela, unfortunately, nothing in this legislation prevents or precludes kids from getting access to violent video games, or for that matter, getting access to violent images or harassing images or intimidating images on social media. And a number of us on both parties talked about the video game, and there are certain First Amendment, at least relations there. There are some already existing standards that you're not supposed to sell the most violent video games of kids below a certain age. Frankly, I think that's kind of casually enforced, and sometimes you get the older brother buying something and sharing it with a younger sibling. I don't know completely how you navigate that. One area that I have worked on for years, and we've not made much progress, is the social media companies, the Facebooks, the YouTubes, the TikToks of the world. Back in the 90s, there was a law that said none of these platforms are responsible in any way for the content that appears on them. It's called Section 230. In reality, what it is a get out of jail free card for any of these social media platforms who will publish and put out some of the most awful images, videos, that then if you try to get them to take it down, they say they have no responsibility. I think about the Allison Parker, who was brutally murdered on camera a number of years back. She was a reporter in Roanoke. She and her cameraman were brutally murdered doing their job by a disgruntled, obviously crazed fellow employee. Allison's dad and mom had literally spent years trying to make sure that those images don't reappear, I believe, on YouTube. And candidly, the responsiveness of the social media company to take that down, they take it down, it pops up elsewhere. I don't buy the fact that they can't, they measure so much of what's happening on these platforms. The idea that they can't allow Allison Parker's family not to have to continue to be exploited and shown the brutal murder of their daughter is just plain wrong. And Section 230 is the thing that protects the YouTubes and Facebooks from this kind of responsible action. And I think it is an area that, at least in terms of kids, we've got to come back and revisit.
We're going to move on to Isabella Ladon with WDBJ.
Hi, Senator Warner. Thank you so much for taking our call. Senator, you're working with other legislators to extend the federal waivers for child nutrition. With the deadline being next week, can we expect to see any progress being made by next Thursday?
Yes. Well, you maybe just got on. That was what I addressed in my opening comments. As you know, kids in Roanoke, kids in Richmond, kids in Hampton Roads, kids in Northern Virginia, across the valley, all across the Commonwealth, since COVID's been in place, we've made it easier for low-income kids to get access to school meals, breakfast and lunch, on a basis that frankly made a lot of sense, particularly during COVID. We're out of COVID, but I believe we ought to continue to allow that easier delivery of food, because all these families qualify for this free or reduced school lunch program, even during the summertime. We ought to keep the easier process in place. But as you said, it expires June 30th. There is a bipartisan agreement that says let's extend so that starting on July 1st, kids in Virginia don't go hungry. Unfortunately, there are a couple of the same usual suspects, I won't call their names, who in many cases are the same suspects who may be trying to hold up the gun legislation, who, I don't know, don't seem to have a lot of caring or compassion for the kids who qualify for free and reduced lunches, even in their own states, let alone what we need to do for kids in Virginia. So I think there's an awful lot of pressure here. I've got to stay optimistic, but you have this is part of the process that people don't fully get about the Senate, that one outlier can literally hold up a bill from getting passed for 3 to 5 days if they use all the procedural hurdles. And I hope, candidly, pressure from my Republican friends, this is a couple Republican senators who are holding this up, that we can bring them to their senses.
We're going to move on to Mia Nelson with ABC 13.
Hi, Senator. Thank you for taking my question. My question for you is on the topic of President Biden's federal gas tax holiday proposal. You told CNN that you want to get more data. What specific data or information is it that you would like to?
Well, listen, Mia, I have, first of all, I've been working on trying to increase our investment in roads and infrastructure since I was governor. And I was very proud of the fact that I was one of the architects of the bipartisan infrastructure bill that literally is going to get hundreds of millions and potentially even billions of dollars into Virginia's road program. We had worked our tails off to make sure that we would pay for that investment. And so I've felt for a long time that you build your roads, you got to pay for them. And a lot of that comes through in a user fee. And that's a gas tax. And let me acknowledge, gas prices are way too high. And one of the things that I think the president, I know he's gotten some grief from Democrats, you should do is get over there to the Middle East, meet even with regimes that I don't like Saudi Arabia, and encourage some of those Middle East countries to increase their oil production to help bring down prices. My concern on the gas tax holiday is, will that full relief, 18 cents, actually pass on to the consumer? I've seen other states like Maryland did this for a short-term period. At first it got passed through the first few days, but it slowly eroded as I fear that the oil companies may simply say, well, we can just make a little more profit and pocket that gas tax rebate. We've also seen for a long time, it used to be back when I was governor, there was literally a 20-cent differential between the gas tax in North Carolina and the gas tax in Virginia. The funny thing, when you cross the border, whether it's from Danville or from Hampton Roads into North Carolina, there wasn't a 20-cent differential. Somehow, magically, the gas prices were a couple cents different, but not anything near 20 cents. Now the difference between Virginia's and North Carolina is about 10 cents, but there's still, all of these differences don't pass through. And I'm also concerned as well, if we do this for 3 months and then suddenly in September you're going to put it back on, it's easy to take a tax off, but are you going to put it back on? If we end up again continuing to hit the Highway Trust Fund and take away these revenues, Virginia could end up losing hundreds of millions of dollars because the trust fund has gone down. Now, I know the president has said, hey, let's find the additional revenues. I'd like to see where he's going to find the additional revenues. I'd like to see data that shows that if there was a holiday, there's going to make sure that all of that savings goes to the consumer. And I'd like to see what the plan would be to make sure that that if prices come down, this revenue stream would return. I am very leery about politicians who like to promise, tax giveaways, tax holidays. I see in Virginia, a lot of one-time federal money, and legislatures made certain decisions on that. But end of the day, again, it's easy in terms of short-term, political news making to promise tax giveaways. But I want to, again, if I've not rejected it outright, but the data I want to see is what kind of guarantees would this actually pass on in direct benefit to the consumers, and how would we ensure that middlemen or oil companies wouldn't simply say, all right, let's just pocket this additional 18 cents.
We're going to move on to Mike Gooding with 13 News Now.
Hi, Senator. Thanks for doing this. You last week were a yes vote on the Honoring Our Pact Act. It looks like it's about an inch or so away from finally passing in the House. I just want to know how satisfying it is for you as a lawmaker to actually have success with a piece of legislation that's going to help millions of vets like this.
Mike, thank you, and thank you for always your interest in this area. I mean, honoring and respecting and maintaining our obligation to our veterans is, I think, one of the most important jobs I have. And that's meant making sure that we get the wait times down at the Hampton VA and other VA hospitals around Virginia. It means it's been a way too long a process, but getting that additional larger facility in Southampton Roads built that will take some of the pressure off the Hampton VA, and a large facility as well built in Fredericksburg. This PACT Act does a couple of things, as you know, Mike. It increases and makes a clear obligation that veterans, a lot of them from Vietnam and some Afghan and Iraq War as well, that were exposed to toxics around burn pits, that they're going to get taken care of with a presumption that their illnesses that they've been exposed came from that exposure around the toxic pits. It would actually add another facility, for example, in Southampton Roads physical structure in the late 20s to go along with the facility that will hopefully open in 24-25 timeframe. Hampton Roads got some of the highest growing veterans population if anywhere in the country. The fact that it got close to 80 votes showed that at least when it comes to veterans, the vast majority of us, regardless of party, are willing to put our country's money where our mouth is to make sure that we honor those obligations for people who have given their lives, provided the service to keep the country safe and free.
Our next question will be Garrett Whiten with CBS 19.
Senator, thank you for taking the time today. I just want to know, will the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act supersede Virginia law allowing 18-year-olds to buy an AR-15?
There is nothing in the bipartisan law that would restrict a 18-year-old from buying an AR-15. It would allow, finally, if that 18-year-old has had a history of mental challenges or has been reported to the police that there might be a threat of violence, it would allow you to make that check and potentially, again, you think about the young man in Uvalde who did that kind of purchase on his birthday. I'm not familiar with all the background issues, but I do think there were some indications of harassment that had taken place on social media. Would that have raised to the level that maybe there ought to be a question? It might put a little bit of time there, but it does not prevent. And let me check on the question about what it would do vis-a-vis Virginia law. I don't believe at this point that it would supersede Virginia law. Virginia can still make the laws, but one of the things that also makes me not able to fully answer the question, there literally was a Supreme Court decision this morning that out of a New York case that appears at first blush to really undermine state laws. So if you've got a Supreme Court action to undermine states making their own choices about what kind of appropriate restrictions to put on gun purchases, that makes while I would rather see the federal law that we're going to pass hopefully later today go further, it makes that at least having a federal law really more essential than ever.
We're going to move on to Amy Knowles with the Virginia Dogwood.
Hey, Senator Warner, thanks for taking our questions. With inflation impacting America, people seem to be putting the blame anywhere they can on leaders, on landlords, on gas companies, and the list continues. Is there a finger to point in this scenario, or if not, how do we keep from scapegoating?
Well, Amy, that's a great question. And Americans, Virginians, got a right to be frustrated. And they want their elected officials, local, state, and federal, to do all they can. The truth is, there are some tools. Can we get increased oil production around the world? That will help drive down the price of gasoline. Can we, that will help. But getting open the supply chains from China, when China has completely gone into lockdown in a community like Shanghai, 45 million people, a lot of things that were in our supply chain there aren't coming to this country on a timely basis, driving up costs. I think we ought to not be reliant on Chinese supply chains going forward. But you can't flick a switch and make that happen. The most powerful tool we've got against inflation is the Federal Reserve. And I wish the Federal Reserve would have raised interest rates last year rather than waiting till this year. But again, even raising interest rates slows down the economy. What we don't want the Fed to do is raise them so quickly that you drive the economy into recession. And I know that is not the kind of simple soundbite answer that some folks want, but at some point, the truth and basic Econ 101, I say this as a former business guy and former governor, has got to be more relevant than soundbite shrillness. I mean, every time you raise interest rates, chances are you're going to lower the stock market. That's going to mean your 401k goes down, even though that may start to take a little bit of the bite out of the demand that will then drive down gas prices. So there is not a simplistic solution. I just was on an intelligence trip to Finland, Latvia, and Turkey, trying to work to make sure Finland and Sweden could join NATO. I was with one of my Republican friends on the trip, who's a good friend, and gas in Finland was $9 a gallon, and I said, "Gosh, is that Joe Biden's inflation screwing up even the Finnish economy?" So I think it's easy to get blamed. There is a lot of finger pointing, but the truth is, if we have these jobs, if you're not willing to kind of either try to respond, try to take actions, but if you're so thin-skinned that you get too upset about the kind of, venting that sometimes comes from folks, you're probably in the wrong line of business.
Our last question today will be Joe Thomas with WCHB.
Thank you, Senator Warner, for taking some time out for us. I wanted to ask about the bipartisan bill and funding red flag legislation in the states, but will there also be funding for court time so there's due process and mental health for when red flag has somebody's firearms taken away? And if you have a moment to talk about your work on the Electoral Count Act.
Great. Thank you, Joe. Thank you. That's actually... Joe is somebody, I say this to my media friends, Joe and I have known each other and agreed on a lot and disagreed on a lot, but I always appreciate his questions and sophistication of a lot of his questions. Let me just say, there is a lot of money on mental health. I think it's $11 billion, but I could be wrong. On the funding for kind of making sure there's appropriate due process protection, I think there is roughly $600 million, but we'll try to get you and everybody on the call, a specific answer. The due process protections under the so-called red flag laws has been a point of contention. I do work a lot with John Cornyn from Texas. This is a critically important issue to him. I know Tom Tillis from North Carolina, this is a critically important issue to him. The fact that they are satisfied that due process and legal rights are protected for citizens, goes a long way to making me, again, feel comfortable. But I think, obviously, there are some senators who are opposing the legislation because they don't feel it goes far enough. This goes back again to the whole notion on this bill. I would have liked to seen it go further on things like the earlier question about, buying assault weapons between 18 and 21. You can't drink a beer. You can't buy a pistol, but you can buy an assault weapon. That doesn't seem to make sense to me. But there are also obviously people that feel it goes too far. And the fact that we got 65 senators on a contentious issue like this, and where the American people are demanding that we don't just do the kind of glib thoughts and prayers when children get butchered, I think is a step in the right direction. On the Electoral Count Act, again, for folks, this was the part, a lot of talk, a lot of activity going on now in the House on the January 6th Commission, an awful day, a day when I was on the floor of the Senate, an insurrectionist, I believe, egged on by Donald Trump, at least that, if not more. We were attacked and assaulted, the Capitol was. Part of what Trump, and thank goodness for Mike Pence honoring the Constitution, but there was at least some ambiguity in a bill, the Electoral Count Act, that I think was passed in like the 1880s, that was about whether you could have the vice president, in effect, override the will of 80 million plus people. Luckily, he didn't see it that way, but there needs to be some clarification. So in one more of these bipartisan gangs, and I'm part of virtually every gang, we have been working 4 months to get a compromise. We think we are about 90% of the way there. My hope is that you will see legislative text in July, and we've been also looking at trying to do some things around making sure that you don't have either party, whoever's in charge, for example, changing postal delivery routes when absentee ballots are out there. And I think, again, some good common sense reforms, and my hope is in July we'll see that package emerge.
And that was our last question. Thank you, everyone, for calling in.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great and happy 4th. And, if you're, think about it again, if we all got to make sure we keep the pressure on the airlines, but I do think as consumers, a little less abuse and maybe a thank you to a flight attendant might help us a bit on the problem, because more of those flights fully staffed means more folks are going to get to their destination on time. Thank you all.